This country is at war with Germany.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Blitzkrieg struck in the north.
This is the Army, Mr. Jones. This is the Army. No private rooms or telephones. This is the Army.
Welcome. I'm Mark Kuzio, your host. Frank Pogorzelski, the subject of this documentary, was a bright young man who, at the time of the Selective Service Act of 1940, was working in Detroit and attending classes at Wayne State College. December 7th, 1941, would drastically interrupt his carefully planned future. Growing up in the Polish community of Glassport, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, Frank absorbed the work ethic, the love of country, and the striving for a better life that characterized many immigrant communities. Along with millions of young men, he enlisted to do the right thing, to defend his country and other countries from aggression. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps, becoming a navigator on a B-17 bomber. His plane went down once over the English Channel. He survived. And it went down again after participating in Black Thursday, the largest aerial bombardment over Germany up to that point. After being captured near the French border, Frank eventually ended up in Stalag Luft III, a POW camp for aviators located in present-day Poland. Stalag Luft III was made famous by the movie The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen. Mr. Pogorzelski was there when the British prisoners made the actual escape that the movie was based on. He endured a terrible winter march that was forced on the POWs as the Russians advanced from the east. And he suffered through starvation, bitter cold, boredom, and disease. The movie you are about to see documents a journal that Frank wrote some years after his wartime experience. It is a fascinating statement of one common man's experience of the war. There is no high drama, no hyperbole, only the everyday experiences and descriptions of events by a young man who felt he was only doing his duty for himself, his family, and his country. You might ask, why make a movie of an experience so typical of so many men? Well, I say that is exactly why it should be done. You are going to meet two of Frank's children and hear them speak of their dad. You will also meet one of his nephews who remembers him during his youth. There will be many photographs. There is vintage Army Air Corps film taken during the war. And you will also hear Frank's own voice on audio cassette as he describes his wartime experience. Let's begin.
At my father's funeral, many people came up to us and kind of made the same comment. They essentially said, your father was the perfect gentleman. He was such a gentleman. And my sister said that many of the sympathy cards that we received after the fact also mentioned that. And I think that kind of sums him up. He was a very polite, nice, unpretentious.
I guess one thing that comes out of this, them talking about their war experiences and so forth, is the fact that my dad never talked about his war experiences from the point of view that he was extraordinary or he was uncommon or he was brave.
That first time where they ditched, and the experience of having to swim under the plane, I was saying, like, how the heck did you get back in the plane the next time?
Right.
And his response was that, pretty much again what motivated everyone else there, which was you didn't want to let your, your co-members, your teammates or whatever down. And that's what got you to climb back in the plane again.
My father, Frank Pogorzelski, was born in 1919 in Portview, Pennsylvania. He was the son of Polish immigrants, Magdalena and Walter Pogorzelski. And when he was growing up, the family moved from Portview to Glassport, Pennsylvania. Glassport is located on the Monongahela River south of Pittsburgh and was a mill town. So Dad grew up in this mill town during the 1920s and the Depression of the 1930s. He was one of 6 children in a Roman Catholic family. And in fact, the first picture, the earliest picture that we found of my father was his first communion photo. And in the first communion photo, he was all dressed up in a little suit and
It's
so
kind of falling
forth.
out of the frame here.
And you could see he has rosary beads, and he has a candle, and he's all dressed up. But like I said, this is the earliest photo that we can find of him. So at that point, he was probably around 7. And later, of course, he attended Glassport High School. And he was actually a very good student and graduated second in his class of a couple hundred students. And actually, he told me he was quite surprised that right before graduation, he was called to the principal's office, and he was asked if he wanted to give an address at graduation because he was the salutarian as second in the class. And he said he was surprised that he had done as well as he did. But so academically he did well. He also loved playing football. And that was a passion that, as far as watching football, that he continued to have all his life. But he was on the Glassport High School football team. He graduated in 1938. And then moved to Detroit, where he joined and worked with his older brother. His older brother, Andy, had a welding shop, a small welding business. And Dad actually became a certified welder for his brother. And so he continued I would say his interest in academics, though, even as a welder. Dad always wanted to go to college, but of course in 1937, 38, when he graduated, his parents couldn't afford to send him to college. His father was a foundry worker. And at that time, there were none or few scholarships available to Polish immigrants' children. So when he was in Detroit, still having this desire to go to college, he took evening college courses at Wayne University. And so he actually did complete a year and a half of credit with those evening college courses at that time. With the war coming and the situation in Europe becoming more and more unstable, and I think at that point also the federal government started the draft, and that was in 1941.
War, Me, page 1. The Congress passed a draft law in 1940. This required all young men to be registered. At that time, I was working and living in Detroit, Michigan. I therefore registered with the Detroit, Michigan Draft Board, number 28. I returned to Glassport, PA, and I tried to get transferred to the Glassport Draft Board Control. The Draft Board of Detroit refused to make the transfer. I was working for Pittsburgh Steel Foundry. Pittsburgh Steel Foundry asked the Detroit Board for a deferment for me. The Detroit Board would not give it. There was a good indication that I would be drafted. I therefore went to the Pittsburgh Air Corps Recruiting Center and applied to become an aviation cadet. I took all the written tests and passed them all. I then started to take the physical examination. The first step was to get weighed. I got on the scale. I was 30 pounds overweight and I failed the physical. Before I left the building, I saw the officer in charge and asked him to hold on to the papers and that I would be at a weight that would be acceptable. I went on a vigorous program of exercise and diet. After 6 or 8 weeks, I lost the weight. I returned to the recruiting station. I made the weight by a pound or 2. I passed the physical and was accepted into the Air Corps for aviation cadet training. In the meantime, the Detroit Draft Board set up a date for my induction as a draftee. I notified the draft board that I was accepted by the Air Corps as an aviation cadet. This rank required higher qualifications than being drafted. The board rescinded my induction as a draftee. In about 7 days, I got my notice to report to Pittsburgh for induction into the Air Corps. I enlisted on February 12, 1942. That morning, I bid goodbye to my sisters and my parents. At the door, my father came to me and kissed me goodbye. This was the first and only time I remember being kissed by my father. He gave me this advice: don't be first, don't be last, be in the large middle. I took a trolley to the old post office building in Pittsburgh. I took the oath, and that evening I was on a train on my way to Maxwell Field, Montgomery, Alabama. The Air Corps inducted many more men than they could handle. The classes were filled to capacity. I, with others, was sent to Selma Field in Selma, Alabama. I spent 8 weeks getting up very early, marching back and forth on the field tarmac, having lunch, then calisthenics and running. At 4 o'clock, I showered and dressed in our Class A uniforms for a parade and a review by the field commander. I then returned to Maxwell Field and started my training. There were classes 5 days a week. The classes covered the subjects thought necessary for aviation. I did good in these classes. I had no trouble. I passed all the subjects. I was then sent to Bennettsville, South Carolina. Bennettsville was a small, private flying school. The barracks were white wood structures. The field was a level pasture. The planes were PT-17s, a light bi-wing plane made of a wood frame covered with cloth painted yellow and blue. I was assigned to an instructor, an older man, for flight instructions. The instructor had 3 or 4 students. The instructor took me up and went through the various elements of flying. We made takeoffs, practiced landings, did the stalls and tailspins. We did chandelles, Immelmans, which were World War I fighting maneuvers. We did slow rolls and loops. After 3 or 4 hours of instruction, I went up alone. I took off, flew around the field a few times, and landed. For another month and a half, I flew solo and with the instructor. On one occasion, I wanted to see how high the plane would fly. I spent the afternoon edging the plane upward. It would not go higher than 10,000 feet. My landings were rough. I had problems keeping the plane in a straight line, especially if there was a crosswind. The instructor had the fine touch. He could land the plane in a straight line. It was hot, and there was no place to go to feel comfortable. Many times I would go to the barracks, take my pants off, and sit in my shorts. I would hang my pants over the back of a chair to minimize the wrinkles. One afternoon I came in, took my pants off, hung them over the back of the chair. I laid down on the bunk and fell asleep. I was awakened by some noise. I looked up. There was a young black man at the door. He said to me, "I'm just cleaning up." I said, "Okay." There were many young black men working and cleaning about the buildings. I did not think any more about it. That evening I decided to go down. I looked in my wallet and a $20 bill was missing. I completed my training in Bennettsville and was to report to Shaw Field, Columbia, South Carolina. It was hot. I was tired, but I had 3 or 4 days to report to the new field. I did not have enough time to take the train to Glassport, stay a while, and return to South Carolina. I therefore decided to stay at Bennettsville. The weather was hot, I tried to find some shade, and I did not have energy or enthusiasm to do anything. I went to Shaw Field. It was on an Army base and airport. The planes here were larger, faster, and made of metal. I was assigned to an instructor, and he was a young officer. We took several flights. He determined I was jerky at the controls. My movements were not smooth. He therefore failed me, and I washed out of pilot training. My classwork was good. I was immediately assigned to navigator training. I was then sent to Monroe, Louisiana. I started classes in navigation. I did the classwork very well. I had no problems with any of the subjects. In fact, I did very well, always near the top of my class with my grades. I completed the course in pre-flight navigation, and I was listed to go into advanced navigation. The advanced navigation classes were full. I, with others of this training class, was sent to Fort Myers, Florida. This was an Air Force gunnery school. The course was about 4 weeks. At this training station, I learned how to operate, shoot, and dismantle 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns, Army semi-automatic pistols, rifles, and shotguns. There was a setup where I rode in the back of a large Army truck around a large oval track. As the truck approached or passed certain locations, a clay pigeon would fly out from the bushes and trees, high, low, left, and right off the truck. I was given a box of 25 shotgun shells, and there was a count of how many clay pigeons were hit. The best I could do in this procedure was 13 out of 25. The last week of training, I flew over the Gulf of Mexico and shot at targets being pulled by another plane. The setup was that 4 planes would fly over the water. One of the planes would tow the target. The other planes would take turns flying alongside the target plane with the gunner shooting a 30 caliber machine gun. Each gunner would have their bullet tips painted different colors. When the target was dropped, it was spread out and the different colored holes were counted. After completing gunnery school at Fort Myers, Florida, I returned to Monroe, Louisiana. On the train ride, we were assigned to a Pullman car. The train came into New Orleans and the Pullman car was detached and moved on to a siding in the railroad yard. We were told that we could go into town. The car would be parked and leave for Monroe, Louisiana at noon the next day. I went into New Orleans, wandered through the streets of the French Quarter. I had supper at Anton's, said to be one of the better known restaurants. I stayed in town overnight. I returned to the Pullman, and that afternoon the car was attached to the train. We were on our way to Monroe, Louisiana. The next day I started in navigation flight training. The time was spent flying to various cities in the South. I practiced what I learned in class. There was dead reckoning, in which ground identifications were used to guide and locate the plane, astronomical daylight shooting of the sun, nighttime shooting of the stars and moon. From these observations, the location of the plane was calculated. The readings were made with an octant. On one flight, I went to Atlanta, Georgia, and returned the next day. Then I flew to Corpus Christi, Texas, to the Naval Flying Station. The Navy pilots were practicing takeoffs and landings in the Flying Boat, PBY.